You might recall that I mentioned the variables are what the researchers are interested in, and the population is who they're interested in. The research questions or hypotheses bring those components of the research together. The research question and/or hypothesis influence what the researcher needs to do when they design a study. But the work actually starts before this point. Researchers typically review a number of empirical and non-empirical sources to make sure they understand the current state of knowledge, including the theories related to the topic at hand. All of that informs the questions and hypotheses for the study. When we refer to a research question, we might be talking about something that's a little more specific than a typical day-to-day question. A research question needs to be empirically testable. In other words, it needs to be something that can be directly or indirectly observed. A research question also needs to identify a variable or relationships between variables. A hypothesis is a prediction about the relationship between two or more variables, so it's more specific than the question. It's also expressed as a statement rather than a question. When a researcher is developing the questions or hypotheses for a study, they may have more than one goal in mind. Typically, those goals will fall into three categories, though. In some cases, researchers simply want to describe the changes in a variable or in a group of people. Those types of studies are guided by research questions, but don't have hypotheses. Those descriptions also help identify behaviors or events that seem to be related to one another, leading to studies with the goal of predicting when an event or behavior will occur. Those types of studies are guided by research questions, but those questions aren't always directly stated. They do usually have explicitly stated hypotheses. The third goal is to explain why the predicted behaviors or events happen as they do. The related studies consider the causes of related behavior, including related thought processes, physiological responses, or social dynamics. Like descriptive studies, explanatory studies typically have a hypothesis that's stated when the researchers explain the study. The related research questions might not be stated, though. The goals of research are influenced by two things: the researcher's interests and what's already known about the topic. The researcher's interests influence what they think about and therefore what they want to study. That focus is sometimes called their research problem. That might seem a little confusing though, because it might create the mental picture of them analyzing a single study or calling out other researchers about something. That's not exactly what we mean by problem in this case. It might make more sense to think of it as a problem they're trying to solve or a situation they're trying to understand. Then the researcher looks at others' work related to that topic, a process called reviewing the literature. That means reading related empirical and non-empirical sources. In other words, the results of studies, reviews, and related theories. In some cases, the review covers decades worth of work. In other cases, it might include prominent theories and recent findings. It varies with the topic at hand, and sometimes what the researcher finds when they start reading. Explanations of the research process move from reviewing the literature to specifying a purpose, which means developing research questions and hypotheses. It's important to note, though, that sometimes a researcher discovers that they might not be able to add to what's already known. Maybe the problem they were trying to solve has been solved, or the situation they were trying to understand has been explained. Maybe the next step in adding to the knowledge requires a type of study they're not interested in or wouldn't have the resources to complete. Regardless of the reason, it's not uncommon for researchers to review the knowledge about a topic and decide to move on to a different topic, or at least a somewhat different focus on the same topic. Researchers tend to adopt a particular perspective that guides all of the studies they conduct. In other words, they tend to be quantitative researchers or qualitative researchers, regardless of the topic. That perspective influences how they express the purpose of a study. Generally speaking, quantitative researchers tend to express the purpose in a more focused question or hypothesis, while qualitative researchers tend to present a more general question. Qualitative researchers don't present hypotheses. It's also not unusual for quantitative researchers to start with an established theory and then present a hypothesis based on that theory. In contrast, the role of theory in qualitative research is a bit more complicated. It might draw on multiple theories or theories from other areas where there might not be a related theory. It's part of the reason qualitative researchers ask more general questions and don't present hypotheses. The thought process is more expansive. As I mentioned in another recording, we'll focus on understanding quantitative studies. In addition to what I said then about those studies being the most common in psychology, they also tend to be a little bit more complicated to understand. For example, quantitative research isn't just more likely to present a hypothesis. It might present more than one type of hypotheses. There are also a few ways we can categorize the hypotheses. We don't come across all of them when we read about studies, but thinking about each of them can help us understand the studies. Broadly speaking, we can differentiate between research hypotheses and statistical hypotheses. The research hypotheses are the predictions the researcher makes about the variable. They can be classified in a few ways, including the type of relationship they represent and whether they specify a direction for the relationship. If the researcher is predicting a difference because a change in one variable causes change in another variable, the hypothesis is experimental. If they're predicting the variables are related without indicating one specifically affects the other, it's non-experimental. Regardless of the type of researcher, relationship a researcher is predicting, the hypothesis can also differ in how specific it is about the predicted difference. A directional hypothesis, also referred to as one-tailed, specifies whether the change we're predicting will result in an increase or a decrease in the variable. A non-directional hypothesis simply says there'll be a difference. When researchers describe hypotheses from a statistical perspective, they refer to alternative hypotheses and null hypotheses. The alternative hypothesis predicts that there is a difference, and the null predicts there isn't a difference. The alternative hypothesis is also sometimes called the research hypothesis, because when we're designing a research study, we're typically predicting a difference. That's the hypothesis researchers write about when they're explaining their study most of the times, and it's the one that helps us understand their focus. Looking at some specific examples might make the difference between the two types of hypotheses easier to understand. I'll use swearing and an experience of pain as an example. And there are actually several studies related to those variables. It might help to pause the slide to compare the different types of hypotheses. The slide includes 2 examples of each, and I'll talk about the difference between the two in the recordings about research design. The reason the questions and/or hypotheses are important to researchers are probably pretty straightforward. They pretty much represent the entire study. When we're trying to understand the study, the questions and hypotheses represent the focus of the study, so they represent what we know based on the results. That means that we can look at the research questions and hypotheses and decide if we even want to look at the results. As savvy skeptics, thinking about the role of the research question and hypothesis helps us think about the assumption and logic of a claim. It encourages us to think about the questions a claim would really answer, which might be different than the questions that are actually being asked. Understanding the idea of a hypothesis and the role it plays in a study helps us think about the predictions the claims would make and the predictions we would make if it was actually true, which might be 2 different things.